acolo este, va fi corner, dragi ascultători.
Hello and welcome back to It Ain't Broke, live from the jungles of Valverde. I'm joined again by author, screenwriter, cake enthusiast, lecturer, Toby Venables. We're talking today about the zombie genre. I think the idea is our last discussion of Star Wars is quite unfocused, and I'm continuing that here because I enjoyed it. But we've got some things to say. You know, we're going to talk about George Romero. We're going to talk about the way things changed at the turn of the century and the resurgence of zombie cinema and its insane pop culture cachet in 2018 and around this time compared to 20 years ago, which I've discussed before. So we've chatted about this. I remember when we met up at ARU for one of the things we did, we just stood around talking about this in the lobby for ages.
Yes.
That's probably a podcast worth of stuff
Probably
right
was.
there.
Probably was.
So give me some thoughts about that. About the word that.
Crikey. Well, I mean, I think what's interesting is zombie cinema has gone through various phases, or two phases, two main phases, really. And I think it's worth remembering also that it's not just zombie cinema, that there's a load of other stuff. I mean, right now, you know, like novels, graphic novels, TV.
Oh God, yeah. So
everything.
Zombie media.
Experiences, everything. I've written a chapter for an academic book on zombies. And, you know, I tell that to people. I say I've written about zombies. Oh right, yeah, it's an academic book, and they're like, really?
See, when the way Toby and I know each other is Toby used to be my teacher at ARU on my film degree, and I did it part time, so it took around 7 decades to do. But when I did touch on zombie stuff, because, you know, the academic text we had available,
yeah,
and I was there kind of the last decade, like, it was so hard to find dedicated books. There's things like the Book of the Dead, and I think Kim Newman's done some stuff in his work, whatever. But like, to find a dedicated zombie thing, and what you would have to do is I would be referencing like a paragraph in a chapter in a book on a completely unrelated topic because I found it in the index of a horror book.
Yeah.
And now this whole dedicated, when you've written
I mean, that's the thing. Like when Romero was doing his thing, it was chucked in with generic horror or splatter films or whatever it might have been, because there were a lot of other films like that happening at the time. But what Romero was doing, I mean, for a start, really, although it's got horror elements, it's really science fiction, and I think that's something that people kind of forget sometimes. Although in the sort of resurgence in the sort of new millennium, when you know, zombies became big news again, and were kind of everywhere. It's like it reasserted those science fiction roots.
Well, the Walking Dead TV show did, in the first season, they did a kind of let's explain the thing where they showed the CRT of the lady's head when she turned into a zombie and stuff like that, and it all seemed a bit unnecessary. Because I found it quite funny with Night of the Living Dead, people always latched on to the radioactive satellite crash thing, and it's like, well, that's what caused it. The film doesn't actually say that. The film throws out a bunch of explanations, and for some reason, and you would get that on the back of the box and stuff. It's like, when a radioactive satellite crash. The inciting incident doesn't matter. It's irrelevant.
No, and actually not knowing just adds to it's like The Thing, where there are John Carpenter's The Thing, that is, where there are things going on, which and you kind of don't. At any one time, you don't have enough information. You never have enough information.
This is kind of the thing with
and
Prometheus
you're
and stuff as well.
You're stressed.
Yeah.
It's like there's claustrophobia and there's stress and uncertainty throughout the whole film because of what you're not being told.
Well, that's why Alien's scary, because it loses so much when it turns out Michael Fassbender did it. You know what I mean? Because it's this unknowable. Weirdly enough, it's scary because it's Alien. And when you suddenly have this kind of involved explanation of where it come from, it just loses so much. Because certain films like I'm a big fan of Return of the Living Dead, the first one, and that does explain what's going on. But the point of Return of the Living Dead is that it is kind of like a sort of affectionate, almost borderline parody kind of creature feature.
Yeah.
So it makes the point of saying, well, actually, Night of the Living Dead was based on this can of gas that we've got in our basement and stuff.
Right.
And that Return of the Living Dead is kind of notorious among certain circles in that it destroyed Day of the Dead at the box office. It's kind of, and everybody walks around thinking zombies say brains, and they don't. It's from that one series of films, and it caught on so, it caught fire in the pop culture for some reason.
Yeah, and it's interesting how that, like, what a zombie is has become. It's similar to like that, like vampires and Dracula. Like there's one work that appears where it takes the folklore and it introduces a whole load of new other stuff, and over time that kind of becomes the new folklore. And like Romero was sort of doing that. He was, because I mean, zombies, in terms of their voodoo roots, these Romero zombies are nothing like this other idea of zombies, whatever they may be.
The word zombie as well, it's not something that Romero particularly put into the text. I mean, in Night of the Living Dead, it's ghoul. Which I really like this. It's like the ghouls, but and
often in the movies, it's the kind of word that no one must utter.
We're not using the Z word.
Yeah, we mustn't.
To quote
so
Shaun of the Dead.
It's picked up on. It's sort of notable enough that it can be sort of parodied.
Walking Dead show busies itself with using terms like Walker is the one they like, but then it seems that every different group calls them like stenchers or bumblers or deadheads or whatever. So you sort of
that's what you'd do. You'd have your own word.
I would hope so. Yeah.
But to be honest, it's like everyone's seen zombie films. Wouldn't they just all call them zombies?
Well, this is this is the interesting thing though, because now this is something that I wanted to talk about. I saw Dawn of the Dead on BBC Two in about 1997, and I had played, or was about to play. I was playing the Resident Evil games as well.
Yeah.
Which I'm still a huge fan of, as people in this neck of the woods know.
That was a very significant.
That's like it's like a biting point, isn't it? It's like a biting point when that takes hold. Because,
yeah,
it's a car thing. I don't even drive, but then the zombie pun. I became a fan of Romero when I saw Dawn of the Dead, and I'd already seen Night of the Living Dead, and I didn't know Day of the Dead was a thing, and I had to hunt and hunt and hunt to find it because there wasn't a current release on tape. So I had to go and get it from a car boot sale. And then because there's a big car boot sale up at the hospital here, I have to go and hunt that out. And then all the zombie stuff we had to go and find. And I remember finding Evil Dead and being really disappointed that they weren't Shambhala zombies, but then actually watching it and finding like how fantastic it was and stuff. And zombie stuff was such slim pickings. And the problem was, I say the problem, but you would hear about a zombie film, you would get Reanimator, and it's no, I want a bunch of people trapped in a place and the thing happens,
Yeah.
And then you'd get Return of the Living Dead and it's like, oh, but they're running around and talking. And zombie stuff was so out of fashion, and it seems hard to believe now, young people, get off my lawn, but you couldn't get zombie stuff anywhere. It was and nobody made zombie films because it was so off trend. And when 28 Days Later came out, I saw that in the cinema 4 times when it came out, because they were never set in England. They were never set in the UK. It was so, apart from like, and then again, you would find Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, and it was this kind of slightly crusty old thing, and it was because not really British, but whatever, it was, Manchester. Like it, you couldn't get it for love nor money, and even 28 Days Later was ashamed of the fact that it's essentially a zombie film, and it is and it isn't, because they're an infection and they're alive, and it is true, but it doesn't matter because the situation it creates is the zombie situation.
Absolutely no difference whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly, and you just couldn't get it anywhere. And when Shaun of the Dead came out, and I've said this before, like I went into Shaun of the Dead, and it's the first time in my life that I felt a film was made for me. Which of course it wasn't. I know Edgar Wright loves me, but I felt like it was made for me because it was like Bub's Pizza and Fulci's blah de blah, and Fulci's the fancy restaurant. We're coming to get you, Barbara. Join us. All this stuff with these things that I was so kind of steeped in at the time. I felt like it was made for me. And then the Zack Snyder Dawn of the Dead remake, written by James Gunn, I actually quite like, and I still do.
I think it's great.
Yeah.
I think it's of all of the remakes of that earlier generation of horror movies, or any movies, I think it's the best probably that I can think of, and it kind of, every time I say that, I sort of smile to myself and shake my head like I just did, and think, yeah, but it's Zack Snyder.
See, that's why, because I've got a bit of a rep for being down on Snyder.
But it's a great film.
It legitimately is. Okay, we're very casual in
off.
Valverde. That's the Valverde ambulance service. John Matrix is in town. He's just been wiping out some of my soldiers, but dealing with it. Well, this is the thing, because I've got a reputation for having to go at Zack Snyder, but it's very un-Snydery because it's not really a Zack Snyder film. It's his first feature, and it's from the James Gunn script.
And it completely works, and it keeps it's different enough, and it's true enough to its source. It's quite different, but it's also recognisably from that film. And you know, as we've said before about, you know, the sequel syndrome is like the same, only different, but it's so easy for it to be too much the same, so it just feels like a retread, or too different, where it feels like it's not really connected to it. But it felt like that, although it's not a sequel, it felt like it trod that path very
It's a funny one, because you
carefully.
could just give it a different name, but then because it's in a mall,
yeah.
you kind of can't.
No,
There was a
no.
game called Dead Rising by Capcom that was set in a shopping mall.
Right.
Really fantastic game. I like my zombie games, whatever. But the Dead Rising box art
Yeah.
I assume had to have, this film is in no way associated with George A. Romero's film Dawn of the Dead, and it was on the box on the front, and it was on the manual, and when you saw promo art for it, because the sequels were set, the one was set in like Vegas type place.
So the zombie mall is kind of is a registered
It's
trademark.
weird, isn't it? It's that kind of Venn diagram of things where suddenly that belongs to someone when you put it in a mall, because it's weirdly specific.
Yeah.
And that's the movement really, because like I said, like, you know, zombie stuff was so off vogue, and you couldn't get it anywhere. And then, you know, Resident Evil did its thing, and I'm a big fan of those, but Resident Evil is kind of a broad horror pastiche, so there's monsters, it's not just zombies, there's kind of monsters and toad beasts and sharks and stuff. But like particularly Resident Evil 2 traded on the zombies in the city thing in all of its promotion.
Yeah.
That, Shaun of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead remake, because that's kind of 2004, those two films, and we'd already had the Resident Evil film, which people know how I feel about that. But that really kicked it into a gear, and then we suddenly got to this point where you couldn't find zombie films anywhere, and then there were too many low quality ones that just kind of flooded the market.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is that like 28 Days Later, let's talk about that for a minute. Because it's the fast zombies. It introduced the fast zombies, and then people get, you know, then there are two kind of types of zombie. Then, I mean, ridiculous, but it's like the fast ones are the slow ones, and which ones do you believe in? It's almost like that, and people get really dogmatic about it, like, oh, that zombie's using tools, they shouldn't be using tools, and that zombie spoke a word, it shouldn't say, you know, it's like these rules have become established. But if you look at Night of the Living Dead, one of my favourite bits, the darkest bit in a way in it, is the kid in the basement.
The trowel.
Yeah, and when she's disturbed, she leaps up, she runs, and she uses a trowel.
Well, Bill Hinsman, the
like,
graveyard zombie, the first zombie you ever see in the Romero canon, picks up a rock and uses it to smash in the window.
Yeah. So it's like, you know, let's not get too...
This is not. We're not going into the fan wank thing. Anyone who watched the Star Wars one, which may have diverged into that a bit, let's not go down that route too much. Because I remember in class when Dead Set came out, we talked about Dead Set in class. Yeah. Which is 2011 or something. Christ. But that did kind of run in zombies.
Yes.
So they were very, you know, you could say if you wanted to put it in a box, they were kind of the Zack Snyder zombies. But what Dead Set did really well, when Dead Set ends, Dead Set is a six-part miniseries written by Charlie Brooker, and it's, in my view, I think it's a precursor to Black Mirror in terms of its tone and stuff like that. It was released on television over Halloween. It's really fantastic. When Dead Set ended, I had the same empty, bereft, hopeless feeling that I got at the end of Dawn of the Dead and end of Day of the Dead, not so much, but Night of the Living Dead as well. It just has this ending that just, particularly the original Night of the Living Dead, Jesus Christ, like the way that ends, just like, and that's why it's so bold. Like it's got all this kind of racial tension stuff in it and kind of nuclear stuff. And then what happens at the end? If you're going to get on my case about spoilers, go fuck yourself. It's out of copyright. Like, no. But Dead Set captured that desperation.
That is something to talk about, actually. And it's just such an obvious question that doesn't get asked often enough, is why do we even watch zombie films? Because apart with a few exceptions, like Shaun of the Dead and maybe 28 Days Later, they do not end well.
Yeah.
It ends with like the big question mark, or like the kind of, you know, like the end of Planet of the Apes, where, you know, falling to the knees, and it's like we're all fucked basically.
Yeah.
And why do we want that? Why? What? I mean, it's a broader question about horror and, you know, terrible things happening and why we enjoy that. But specifically, like zombies and the notion that the world is ending and wanting to watch that. Because I remember saying in class once, part of us, well, there are reasons why we obviously do want to watch zombie films, because you know, they've been hugely popular. There's a massive resurgence in the first decade of the millennium for sure, and it's sort of waned now, but there was that real kind of like frenzy. And why do we want to watch them? Why do we want to see the world absolutely go to shit? Because there's, on the face of it, there's nothing pleasurable about that on any level. And yet we do.
You could just sort of say, look out the window as well, because it's not as if we live in, it's not like we live in particularly pleasant times, so it's not like, well, we're going to entertain the dark thing.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the kind of post 9/11 world, things got a bit kind of more cynical in the eyes of a lot of people. And you would think in the kind of dark times you would be looking at something optimistic, and then in the optimistic times you'd be looking at something dark.
Yeah.
I tell you what, I remember so I watched Dawn of the Dead on TV, or we taped it, BBC Two, like I said, in the 90s. So we were in school, and what we used to do, it's the same way I saw Pulp Fiction for the first time as well. My family lived quite close to the school I went to, secondary school, so we were allowed to come home for lunch and eat. So we'd come home and watch these films in like 55-minute segments. Right. So it was Dawn of the Dead, Pulp Fiction as well, like 55-minute segments. And as soon as we watched it, it was me and my bro mostly, but then we brought like mates over. It's like, you've got to see this movie. And the immediate discussion was like, what would you do? What would you do? What's your plan? And I still have this. I had a discussion with. I've had this discussion on dates and stuff, which normally means it's going well. It's like, what would you do? Like, you know, with other zombie enthusiasts, you have that kind of fantasy element of how you would cope and how you would deal with it.
Yeah.
And then I'd have zombie dreams. And it'd be like how I coped. And I remember one of my mates, I brought him into it kind of quite late, like in the last 10 years. And then he comes the next time I saw him, he's like, Richard, I had a zombie dream. Because it creates this kind of, as a kind of sandbox scenario, it creates this kind of mental...
But the particular test, and because when I said to my students, okay, look, part of us wants to see the world destroyed. It's not just like we're watching something that is well, it is a disaster, but the way we're relating to it is more complex, in that part of us desires it as well. We want to see it happen, and actually I kind of recognize that in myself. Like when I'm watching it, there's a bit of a thrill about everything sort of like collapsing, and even like, you know, and like alien invasion movies and things like that, seeing everything get destroyed, there's a kind of glee which is like, well, it's sort of irrational. But the other part of that is there's also the challenge. Well, one of my students said, well, I don't want to see the world sort of go to shit. I don't want to see the world falling apart. And it's like, I think you're missing the point here, that it's not necessarily conscious, that it's complex and it's happening on a number of levels. But I'm convinced, to me, it's what those films are about. There is a desire for the modern world that we live in now to in some way just be taken down, and for us to be living more simply. And part of that whole challenge of like the zombie scenario, what would I do? It's like all of the things that are around us which happen, which we can't, we're in control of millions more things, but we're not actually touching them anymore. We're not in touch with them anymore. So it's like all this digital technology which surrounds us, and that has an effect on us, which makes us feel detached and in a way insecure, I suppose. And there is something comforting, even if it means the end of the world. There's something comforting in it being broken down into like food, water, sleep, survival, just those basic things. You know, it's why people go camping and find it relaxing. Right. Because it's just like, you're not thinking about, you know, the internet or Wi-Fi or Trump or hopefully, or any of those things. You're just thinking, if he's still president, maybe by the time this goes out, who knows? But
oh, the comments are on fire already.
but that is, I'm sure people have had camping experiences that are quite close to zombie apocalypse experience. I know I have.
Yeah.
but actually, I think they're tapping into the same thing, like starting a fire. These are all skills that we've lost, largely.
Well, there's that return to the kind of primal thing. Well, I did beavers, cubs, scouts, and then cadets. And I'm not that kid though. Like I was sort of like quite a scrubby, sort of chavvy kid in a tracksuit. But we got to go camping and we learned how to make fires, and we did like the best part of that was going off into the woods and bivouacking and making fire. And there's skills I carry forward as well, because when I'm a good person to camp with, just so you know, because I know how to build a fire and cook the meat and all that.
Yeah.
And I love, and I still love that. And there is that kind of return to something a bit more basic and...
Yeah, absolutely. And it's stuff that we know we've lost touch with. Because I've said to a room full of people, how many people in this room could light a fire without matches or a lighter? Would know how to do it. One person put their hand up, and it's because they're from Finland. I don't know why that is, but it's just they're from Finland.
I know the theory to do that, but I've never actually done it. But I know the theory to start a fire without matches, but I've never actually... So I can very confidently be like, oh, I'll start a fire. But when it comes down to it, I'll be there hunched over a twig, like crying.
There are ways to do it. There are ways to do it. And just to sort of declare an interest, I wrote my first novel was a zombie novel, but the zombies were in the Viking period, so it's like Vikings versus zombies. So it kind of takes zombies back to this early medieval setting. And actually what I realised was, one of the attractions of doing that in the first place was realising that actually Vikings are really pretty well equipped to deal with this. But also later, after I'd written it and was sort of thinking about it, I kind of thought, you know what? All this stuff in every zombie film when they say, get out of the city, everyone knows that you've just got to get out of the city, because the city is the worst place. And it's not just the worst place in practical terms, it's the worst place in terms of where our heads are at.
It's almost an excuse, isn't it? It's an excuse to leave the
modernity.
city.
And actually you get out into the countryside, and what most zombie films don't really deal with, although some do, is like that starting again thing, going back to basics. And going back to basics, that's basically becoming medieval.
Well, we talked about this before, and I've said this before as well. My relationship with the Walking Dead TV show is Stockholm Syndrome, in that I've watched enough of it that I've fallen in love with my captor and I can't give it up. And it's sort of like Stuart Lee had this analogy, like if Channel 4's an open sewer, then E4's like you've deliberately built a sluice into your house to sling shit in your face. When I'm getting hold of The Walking Dead, I'm like, why am I doing this? But anyway, we had a conversation about this before. One of the communities in the more recent seasons of The Walking Dead has a forge, and they all ride around on horseback, and they've made their own armour and kind of pikes and stuff like that. So they have reverted to that medieval kind of...
Well, because, I mean, it's all very well holding up... I mean, this is the point of going back to Dawn of the Dead. The point of that is those people hold up in a shopping mall surrounded by this stuff which isn't going to be made anymore, and there's this sort of dwindling, finite, rotting resource with bullets in guns that are not going to be replaced, that are going to run out because no one in the world is making them. It's like they're fucked. It's like you're dead. You're dead.
The best
you
section,
leave or you die.
The section in that film where it's just after they clean out the mall and Roger dies. There's this kind of great sad montage of them enjoying the kind of the spoils, and as soon as they've overcome all that adversity, it doesn't mean anything, and they've come to realise that all they're going to do is stagnate and rot. And there's even when Peter's kind of like smacking the tennis balls over the roof, one goes over the side and it cuts to a desiccated corpse on the floor, and that's intercut with them kind of the failure of Flyboy and Fran's relationship, and Peter's out on his own. They're sitting around in kind of fur coats, putting lipstick on and playing with cameras and stuff, and they just decay and they just fall into this malaise because they've got nothing to... They're in this kind of like mausoleum essentially, and they've got nothing to do, and they have no purpose or meaning. They're just locked away.
It is like this medieval fortress where they're fighting off these they're besieged.
It's the siege thing,
and they're protecting. It's like they're protecting what's left of society, but actually, what's left, what they're protecting is worthless. Is of no value to them or anyone. And what they really need to be doing is something totally, utterly different.
And when the bikers come, the imagery is like, yeah, they kind of meaninglessly steal stuff, but like one of the bikers smashes up the TV with a sledgehammer and stuff. Whereas that's something that our survivors had kind of treasured and still couldn't let go of because they've sat around it. And then, when it's like, there hasn't been a broadcast for days, and he's just like watching the static and stuff. Like they've kind of they couldn't stop worshipping the television, but then when the bikers come, this kind of mad force of nature, they just come and smash it with a hammer.
And that, to me, is what zombie movies have always been about, like going medieval, returning to this chucking out a load of stuff that, I mean, and I know Romero certainly sort of felt that way about it, that you absolutely have to discard all this stuff in order to move forward. And the reason why I think there is this resurgence in the sort of first decade of the millennium is because of digital technology, because actually that just makes that anxiety about modern society far deeper. In particular, this feeling that we're seeing and controlling things apparently that are global. That we can talk to people anywhere in the world, but we're not touching them, and we're not talking face to face with each other quite so much, maybe. And I think it's that sense of a sort of false sense of control, combined with a feeling of detachment and alienation, which actually is there's a craving in us to return to just sort of like tactile objects, to do things with our hands, because the one thing we do not do now is actually touch physical objects so much with our hands. We're touching,
looking at pictures
we're touching buttons which don't even exist because they're on a touch screen. So, and I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying it has. Yeah,
I'm quite resistant to call technology bad, because I think there's a kind of real sanctimonious thing. Is like, well, everybody just sits on the train looking at their phones. Yeah. No, fuck you. 30 years ago, everybody sat on the phone looking at their newspaper, and half of them knew someone who died of polio. Don't tell me that things have got worse in that regard. However, you are correct, because part of that as well is the lack of face-to-face interaction. I can talk to anybody I want around the world whenever I want, but in that situation where all that goes, I'd then be forced to have the kind of face-to-face. Yeah. So something, the kind of parallel motif, if you like, to the kind of resurgence of the zombie stuff, in the bigger budget end of things, which the Venn diagram there is World War Z, if you like.
Yeah.
Since the similar time the zombies thing has resurged, and this is maybe a 9/11 thing, of which I keep bringing up for some reason, it's the large-scale destruction of cities again and again and again and again and again. Time after time, superhero films do it. There's kind of that disaster film, Roland Emmerich resurgence, Alien Invasion, and Independence Day. But it's and if you're kind of talking about the kind of destruction of modernity, imagery of city destruction again and again and again, and it's still going on. And it's the present trend seems to be a big blue light comes out the sky and destroys the city. But like the Fantastic Four, the two movies they did together, they did that as well. Yeah. Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman have that kind of really grim city destruction stuff, and it's the destruction of modern spaces.
Yeah,
again and again.
It's presented as a problem which needs to be solved, but it's more than that as well. It's because it's something that in itself is a spectacle that we love and enjoy. And especially, Independence Day being the it's almost kind of like, destroy something else, blow up something else. And actually now, that image of the White House being blown up has taken on a whole new set of associations. But quite apart from that, there is something. It's complicated. Even though it's like the most simplistic blockbuster, maybe there are complex things going on, and it really riles me when people are dismissive about particularly Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff. Like, oh, it's just like people with powers which came from space just punching things, and it's like, well, yeah, it largely is that, but in addition to that, there's a whole load of other stuff going on, which is very, very complex and very kind of sometimes really challenging. And this could easily lead into Infinity War, but I'm not going to go there.
Discussion for another time, I
Definitely.
think. Discussion for another time. Well, speaking of time, we've just about run out. So that was good fun. I enjoyed that very much. Would you like to? You're very welcome in this low rent situation to plug your novels and such. If you would like to. You have.
I write novels.
He writes novels. But what's the name of your Viking?
The Viking. Yeah, good point. I didn't mention it. Crap marketing. The first novel was called The Viking Dead. Vikings, zombies, boom. Then there's a trilogy, which is about, the first book is called Night of Shadows, the second is called The Red Hand, and the third is called, what's it called? Hood, just Hood.
You asked me.
Yeah, I do. And it's a trilogy in which it's the Robin Hood legend, but it's sort of flipped. So Guy of Gisborne is the hero, and Hood is not nice.
It's not nice. There you go. And those
He's
are
a psychopath.
published by Abaddon Books.
Abaddon,
What
yeah.
is the kind of prose arm of Rebellion? What owned 2000 AD? And I just like to plug 2000 AD all the time because I love it.
My proudest moment. I'm sorry, just hitting the microphone. My proudest moment ever in my life, apart from my wedding, of course. I just had to say that is when there was an advert for one of my novels on the back of 2000 AD.
I saw that, yeah.
And I'll never get over that. I will never get over that.
I had a letter in there in the 90s. That was my favourite. All right, well, thank you very much, Toby.
Thank you.
Have you back again soon. I hope you enjoyed that, ladies and gentlemen. Like and share and subscribe and follow us on that internet. What the kids like. We're young and trendy. Woo!